Okay, let's really try and get our heads around this. $30 billion, that's the figure, roughly, for U.S. aid going into Pakistan between 2000 and 2013. It's a staggering amount of money.
It really is.
But here's the part that's always baffled me. I think a lot of people. How could the U.S. provide so much support, so much aid to a country that seemed to be actively working against American interests right next door in Afghanistan?
That's exactly the puzzle, isn't it? It's the core paradox we want to dig into in this deep dive. You have this massive flow of assistance, financial, military, you name it. And yet the recipient, Pakistan, frequently takes actions that seem to directly undermine what the U.S. is trying to achieve, especially in that region, South Asia, Afghanistan.
So our mission today really is to try and unpack that. Why did this happen? Why did Pakistan, despite all that aid, often seem to be, pulling in a completely different direction?
Exactly. And to help us understand this, we're relying heavily on the research of Christine Fair. She's a real expert in security studies, spends a lot of time on the ground there, associated with places like Georgetown, Rand Corporation. Her work is vital here.
Right, because she really focuses on the internal dynamics within Pakistan, doesn't she? The power struggles, the institutions.
Precisely. And her research suggests that you can't understand the U.S.-Pakistan relationship without understanding who really holds the power inside Pakistan. And that's the fundamental issue.
Which boils down to?
It really boils down to this deep imbalance. It's not usually the elected civilian government calling the shots on the big stuff, national security, foreign policy, especially when it involves India or Afghanistan.
That's the military's domain.
Overwhelmingly, the military establishment holds the reins there.
Okay, so let's talk about India. Fair's research really hammers this home. Pakistan's whole strategic view seems almost defined by its relationship or maybe obsession with India.
Obsession is a strong word, but maybe not inaccurate in this context. It's deeply rooted. And yes, Kashmir is often the flashpoint people mention.
The immediate thing you think of.
Right. But the military's concern, as Fair lays out, goes way beyond that specific territory. They see India's overall rise, its economic power, its diplomatic clout, as, well, an existential threat almost. A challenge to Pakistan's own position in the region and even in the wider Muslim world.
It feels like history really casts a long shadow here.
Yeah.
You've got the three major wars. 47, 65.
And 71.
And 71, the big one. Losing East Pakistan, which becomes Bangladesh, that must have been just devastating, particularly for the military. Does Fair suggest that fuels this kind of revisionist thinking, this need to push back?
Oh, absolutely. That historical context is crucial. Losing nearly half the country in 71 was a profound trauma. And because India's military is conventionally much stronger, Pakistan developed the strategy of asymmetric warfare, meaning using unconventional tools to level the playing field, or at least counter India's advantages. Think of it like fighting differently, because you can't win head-on in a traditional war.
Okay, so what does that toolkit look like? Fair mentions the nuclear program, obviously.
Yes, the nuclear arsenal is key. They see it as their ultimate insurance policy, a strategic shield against India. But maybe even more relevant to the U.S. situation is the other part of the strategy.
The proxy groups.
Exactly. Cultivating and supporting a network of jihadist groups. Fair specifically names organizations like Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, groups responsible for major attacks.
And critically for this story, the Afghan Taliban.
Using these groups for attacks, for influence operations, particularly in Afghanistan and Kashmir. It's a way to bleed India or counter Indian influence without direct confrontation.
And this is where that internal power dynamic you mentioned really comes into play, right? The civil-military divide?
It's absolutely central. Fair's research makes it clear. On these core issues, India policy, the nuclear program, managing these proxy groups, the military calls the shots.
Not the elected prime minister or parliament.
Not really. Civilian leaders, whether from Benazir Bhutto's PTP or Nawaz Sharif's PMLN, they've historically had very little actual control over the ISI, the main intelligence agency, or the overall strategic posture. It's like the military handles the hard security portfolio, and civilians, well, they handle other things.
So what happens if a civilian leader tries to change things, say, improve relations with India or rein in the ISI?
Well, Fair documents how those attempts have usually been met with pretty stiff resistance, sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle, even leading to political instability crises, sometimes allegedly orchestrated or encouraged by the military itself.
Wow. So the military sees itself as what? The guardian?
Pretty much, the guardian of national security, the guardian of Pakistan's ideology, and they use that self-proclaimed role to justify having this, frankly, enormous influence over everything. It's baked into the system.
Which brings us right back to the $30 billion U.S. aid meant for the war on terror, flowing in between 2000 and 2013.
A huge sum.
But Fair's research presents this deeply counterintuitive picture of what happened to that money. It didn't just fail to achieve U.S. goals.
No, it seems, based on the evidence Fair and others present, that it may have actively worked against U.S. goals, instead of helping dismantle militant groups.
The money went elsewhere.
There's significant evidence suggesting that elements within the Pakistani military establishment diverted some of those funds, maybe to expand their nuclear program faster than they otherwise could have.
Okay, that's bad enough from a non-proliferation standpoint.
But it gets worse. The research suggests funds were also used to continue supporting and sheltering the very jihadist proxies we just talked about. The ones targeting India, yes, but also targeting Afghan interests.
And by extension, American interests and soldiers in Afghanistan, supporting the Afghan Taliban.
Directly contradicting the entire U.S. mission there. Fair calls it a glaring failure of U.S. policy post 9/11. You're essentially funding an entity whose intelligence agencies are, according to numerous reports and analyses, linked to groups killing your own soldiers.
Hard to comprehend, honestly. How could that happen?
Yeah.
To understand that, maybe we need to go back further. Look at how this civil-military relationship developed historically.
Yes, Fair's analysis is really helpful here. This military dominance isn't new. It goes way back to Pakistan's founding.
The early years?
Exactly. In those early decades, you had fairly weak, unstable, divided civilian governments, and the military sort of positioned itself as the only stable institution, the ultimate arbiter of power, as Fair puts it, the ones who could keep the country together.
And they weren't shy about intervening. I remember reading about constitutional loopholes they used.
Right. There was this mechanism historically where the president, often backed by or part of the military, could dismiss an elected government. It gave a kind of legal veneer to military interventions, framed as necessary for stability.
Like General Musharraf's coup in '99 against Nawaz Sharif. That seems like a classic example.
Absolutely prime example. Musharraf took power, but then he also became president while still being army chief. Fair points out this tradition of military figures just directly running the country. It wasn't unusual.
So during that time, the military's power was pretty much absolute.
Largely unchecked in the areas that mattered most to them. Presidents were often military men or heavily reliant on military support, keeping civilian governments on a pretty short leash.
But then things started to shift. Fair points to around 2008, Musharraf's exit. That was a turning point.
It seems to have been, yes. It created an opening, and then something quite unexpected happened.
Asif Ali Azari, Benazir Bhutto's widower, right?
Yes. When he became president, he actually made a very significant move. He voluntarily gave up some key presidential powers.
Including the power to just dissolve parliament, the thing the military had used.
Exactly that. He transferred that authority to the prime minister. Fair stresses how important this was. It basically dismantled a major constitutional tool the military had exploited for decades to legitimize coups.
So one legal path for direct intervention was closed off.
It was a major step. But there was another shift happening too, according to Fair's research. Public opinion.
People were getting tired of military rule, even if they were frustrated with politicians.
It seems so. Polls started showing that even with all the problems of corruption and inefficiency, most Pakistanis preferred democracy, however flawed, to another military dictatorship.
So suddenly, staging a coup wasn't just a logistical challenge, it had a real political cost.
A potentially significant one. The army is very conscious of its public image. Fair suggests they recognize that another overt takeover could lead to serious backlash, both domestically and internationally. It just wasn't as appealing an option anymore.
Okay, so direct coups became less viable. But, as Fair argues, the military didn't just pack up and leave politics.
Not at all. They adapted, they found new ways, maybe more subtle ways, to maintain influence. A new playbook, you could say.
What did that involve? Fair mentions the judiciary.
In earlier years, yes. There was a period where it seemed the military could rely on sympathetic judges in the higher courts to hamstring civilian governments. using things like corruption cases, disqualifications, politically motivated legal action.
But that became less reliable.
Fair notes that after about 2014, the judiciary started showing more independence. So that particular tool wasn't as dependable for the military anymore. They needed other methods.
Needing to.
This newer phase that Fair describes, things like media manipulation, trying to shape the narrative, civil society infiltration, influencing NGOs and other groups, and political engineering.
Political engineering, what does that mean in practice? Fair mentions Imran Khan.
Yes, her research discusses the perception and allegations that the military establishment played a significant role in promoting Imran Khan, seeing him perhaps as a more pliable political figure compared to the established parties.
So backing certain factions, maybe influencing elections behind the scenes.
That's the kind of thing suggested, along with using mass protests, street theatrics, as Fair sometimes calls them, possibly funded or directed by the ISI, perhaps even indirectly using resources freed up by foreign aid. It's about creating an environment where their preferred outcomes are more likely.
So it's less about tanks on the streets and more about controlling the political ecosystem, pulling the strings indirectly.
Exactly. It's a subtler model, this indirect role, but potentially just as effective at ensuring the military's core interests, especially regarding India, nukes, and strategic direction, remain protected, regardless of who is formally in government.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. We dove into Christine Fair's research, and the picture that emerges is one of this persistent, really deep imbalance between civilian leaders and the military in Pakistan.
Driven, fundamentally, by that intense strategic focus on India.
Right. And this imbalance has profoundly shaped Pakistan's foreign policy and its relationship with the U.S. The whole aid paradox that $30 billion makes more sense, sadly, in this context.
It suggests the U.S. attempt to buy cooperation in the war on terror was perhaps doomed from the start, or at least deeply flawed, because it didn't account for these internal dynamics. The aid, inadvertently, may have even strengthened the military's hand against U.S. interests.
And we've seen how the military's methods evolved from direct coups being commonplace
To these more subtle, indirect forms of control, manipulating media, politics, maybe the courts at times. But the underlying dominance in key security areas seems to persist.
So hopefully, by looking through the lens of Fair's work, you, our listeners, have a clearer picture now of why the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has often been so difficult and contradictory. That was really our goal today.
Yeah, to understand the why behind the headlines.
And it leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on, doesn't it? Given everything we've discussed, the history, the military's adaptability, this entrenched focus on India, what are the real long-term chances for genuine civilian supremacy in Pakistan?
And flowing from that, what does it all mean for future U.S. foreign policy? How should the U.S. or any outside power engage with a country with such complex internal power dynamics?
No easy answers there, for sure.
Yeah.
But it highlights the complexity of the region and why understanding these internal civil-military relations is just so critical. It's something for you to think about.